Hello and welcome to cafetography.co.uk. Today we're looking at one of Sigma's newest lenses in their lineup, and a lens which is pretty unique in what it can do. The Sigma 120 to 300mm f2.8 OS HSM-S. This is the new Sports Edition, which has a different optical and physical design to any of its predecessors. And although it carries the Sports designation, its zoom range makes it a very versatile lens for all kinds of photography work. The first thing you'll notice is its very large size. It's definitely a good thing that this lens comes with a free carry case. This is an f2.8 lens, which means it can let in a lot more light than other telephoto lenses, and it can also give you a blurrier background, or a more narrow depth of field. This means you can get faster shutter speeds, which is always a huge bonus, especially for stopping action, and the narrow depth of field also means it could make quite a handy portrait lens, as well as being useful for other kinds of creative photography. The lens fits both full frame and APS-C cameras, and it's a unique zoom lens on the market. Its price of around £2,500 is a lot of money in real terms, but compared to similar lenses, it's actually good value. The build quality of this lens is very nice and rugged, although there are one or two small flaws. The zoom ring is nice enough, but it's quite firm and not the smoothest to use. The lens's body is made of metal, so it's tough and it'll take quite some punishment, but it also weighs over 3 kilograms, so despite the optical stabilization, you'll want to use a tripod with it if you're shooting for long periods of time. A couple of screws were a bit loose on our copy of the lens, so you have to be careful how you handle it. But there are also lots of good things to say. The focus ring is very smooth and precise on this lens, and the autofocus is quite quick and very accurate. This lens also has good optical stabilization, which has an optional panning mode. Here's some handheld video footage without optical stabilization, and here it is turned on. As you can see, there's quite a difference, and that often translates into sharper pictures and, obviously, smoother video footage. So overall, although it's not quite built to the tightest standards, the lens is built very nicely indeed, and it's plenty good enough for whatever your needs are in the field. So let's move on and look at picture quality. First, we'll test it on a full frame camera, in this case a 20 megapixel Canon 6D. We'll start by zooming out to 120mm and opening the aperture to f2.8. In the middle of the image we can see that, already, the lens is extremely sharp, and this sharpness continues into the corners of the image. There's almost no chromatic aberration, so this is an extremely impressive performance. Colours and contrast are also excellent. There's a tiny increase in sharpness when you stop down to f4, and the corners are slightly brighter too, but really you're just improving upon excellence. Well, let's zoom in to 200mm. At f2.8, the centre of the image is very sharp, again, with good colours and contrast, and the corners of the image are the same, with very little chromatic aberration. Stop the lens down to f4, and the sharpness goes from being very good to excellent, from the corners right back into the middle. That's about as sharp as it gets. Again, a very impressive performance. Finally, let's zoom all the way into 300mm. With the aperture wide open at f2.8, astonishingly, the centre of the image remains extremely sharp, with no lack of contrast. This is an extremely impressive performance, which is particularly satisfying as being sharp in the middle of the image is probably the most important thing for most people at this focal length and aperture. When we look into the corners, the lens finally shows a little weakness. The corners are noticeably softer, but thankfully still decently sharp for most uses. When we stop down to f4, the corners are a little sharper and brighter, and at f5.6 they're very good indeed, with notably little chromatic aberration. The middle of the image remains excellent. So, on a full frame camera, we see extremely impressive picture quality all round, especially for a fast zoom lens. There's only a slight weakness in the corners at 300mm, but it's nothing really to worry about as, at that focal length, your subject will normally be in the middle of the frame anyway. Well, not everyone uses full-frame cameras, so let's test it on a cropped sensor APS-C camera, in this case an 18 megapixel Canon 60D. The focal length here is the equivalent of 192 to 480 mm, so it's even more of a telephoto lens. We'll start at 120 mm with the aperture wide open at f2.8. The centre of the image, again, is extremely sharp, and it's the same story in the corners of the image. Typical for an APS-C camera, you can see slightly more chromatic aberration on contrasting edges, the diagonal lines on this picture. But it doesn't really reach a problematic level. The image is about the same at f4 and at f5.6. A really great performance. Let's zoom in again to 200 mm. At f2.8, in the centre of the image, we see excellent sharpness once again. The corners are slightly less sharp, but the chromatic aberration we saw earlier has now gone. Stop the lens down to f4 and things pick up very nicely, and at f5.6 the lens is extremely sharp in the corners as well as back in the middle. Another very good performance. Finally, let's zoom all the way into 300 mm. With the aperture wide open at f2.8, we see a very similar performance to a full-frame camera. The lens is very sharp in the middle, where it counts the most. But the corners are softer, although thankfully there's still no chromatic aberration. Stop down to f4 for a small improvement in sharpness, and at f5.6 they're as sharp as they're going to get. So overall, the lens also turns in a very admirable performance on APS-C cameras. The corners are a bit more of a struggle at 300 mm, but the excellent colours and contrast, lack of chromatic aberration, and excellent centre sharpness more than make up for this. Sharpness isn't everything, so let's take a look at distortion and vignetting levels. On APS-C cameras this isn't really an issue, so let's look at the full frame performance. At 120 mm and f2.8, we see only slight barrel distortion, and the corners aren't too dark. When we stop down to f4, the corners become slightly brighter. This is a very good performance. But typically for a zoom lens, the telephoto end of the zoom range is a slightly harder playing field. When we zoom in to 300 mm, we see stronger vignetting in the corners at f2.8, and some noticeable pincushion distortion. As you can see, the straight lines in this chart are bending inwards a little. However, if you stop down to f4, then the corners brighten up nicely. Overall, the lens performs fairly well in terms of distortion and vignetting. Another great performance is the quality of this lens's bokeh, or the out-of-focus areas. At 300 mm and f2.8, the blur potential of this lens is very good indeed. As you can see here, the quality of the out-of-focus areas is very smooth and non-distracting. The background simply melts away. So overall, this lens is another astonishing achievement for Sigma. It's built well, it has good image stabilization, it has a great zoom range, especially for shooting sports or indoor events, and the wide maximum aperture gives you fast shutter speeds and beautiful, compressed, out-of-focus backgrounds. Optically, the lens is a sharp and very dependable performer, giving punchy images. Its size and weight mean it's not exactly inconspicuous or easy to hold for long periods of time. But that's just part and parcel of a lens of this nature, and the professionals who need this lens will be happy to use a tripod with it. The price point is high, but it actually represents good value, although most people will want to rent this lens for children's sports games or shooting plays. But whether you buy or rent, this lens is unique and of very high quality, and it comes highly recommended.